Hi, I'm Tiffany Messer, and I'll be discussing the implications to tap and stream water chemistry due to variations in sampling locations and watershed land use that we conducted over the past year funded by UK Cares. So just to give a little bit of background and address the knowledge gaps, surface water chemistry is affected by land use, and therefore understanding what to expect from specific areas with different land uses improves the efficiency of management practices, particularly for water treatment processes. Additionally, there's limited information regarding potential exposure and introduction of heavy metals and sulfate entering rural water treatment plants, particularly in the Appalachian region, which led us to this particular study. The objectives and hypothesis of the study was number one, to conduct a citizen science tap water campaign, including 70 residential homes with a variety of water outlets, including indoor faucets and outdoor spigots, source water, including wells, springs, and water treatment plants, and counties. And we hypothesized sampling location, spigot, or faucet would influence water chemistry. Additionally, we wanted to complete an in-stream monitoring campaign at 9 field sites in the region and compare residential water samples with the watershed samples to see if there was similar water chemistries at the surface waters that we sampled in those same watersheds. And so here on this image, we have the different watersheds we were looking at. And additionally, it shows that there's a lot of mining in this region, particularly where all these little white and black dots are. For the home sample collection, we did sample 70 homes. We had two questions we'd ask. We would ask where the source of their water was, and did they have a water softener or filter to make sure that we were sampling the actual source of water and not something that had already been filtered. We looked at heavy metals, semi-volatile organic compounds, nutrients, and sulfate. And we also conducted a river sample collections at 9 sites that we sampled monthly, and we looked at the same contaminants along with water pH, water temperature, dissolved oxygen, and total dissolved solids. So this is some of our results. And the one thing I really want to point out particularly is this Owsley County results here. We are comparing first catch of residential water compared to flush line. So this is where we catch the water or we let the line flush for 3 to 5 minutes. And what we found, particularly in Owsley County, is that we had higher concentrations for all metals for the first catch compared to the flush lines. This primarily was due to Owsley County having a significantly higher amount of spigot samples compared to faucet samples. The faucet samples were inside. Spigot samples a lot of times would sit in the lines for a much longer period compared to the in-home faucet samples. And this is likely why we had these results with the higher metals, where the water had just been sitting and exposed to the pipes for an extremely longer period of time. We also had an interesting observations with sulfate, comparing both the surface water to the residential. And what we found is that in the surface water, we did have exceedingly high sulfate concentrations in Breathitt County, which is also relatively close to a lot of these mining sites that we were near. And additionally, we saw in Breathitt County that we had higher residential tap water samples with sulfate exceeding the 250 milligrams per liter secondary limit for EPA. So the secondary limit, just to remind you, is not a primary limit. It's not something that we're worried about for health implications, but it's more of a taste and the way the water looks exposure that is why it's called a secondary limit. But the interesting part for us was that in areas that we had these higher sulfate concentrations in the tap water, we also were in the same watersheds that we had higher sulfate concentrations in the surface water. And that's shown here on this image, where in this green and blue, the green and red area here, these red little bubbles are the homes that had the higher sulfate results. So we hypothesized that sample location, spigot, or faucet would influence water chemistry, and that residential water samples within a watershed would have similar water chemistry at the surface water samples in the same watershed. And we found that spigot samples had higher heavy metal concentrations in first catch samples, but once they were flushed, they were similar to other samples and well below the EPA regulated levels. And there was no statistical significance for between spigots and faucets after flushing the lines. Additionally, higher sulfate concentrations were observed, particularly in the Breathitt County area near the mining sites, for both residential and surface water samples. Future research is, while higher sulfate concentrations could be due to alternative land uses near these sites, such as the mining, more research is really necessary to verify the specified land use impacting these observations and potential sources of increased sulfate in residential water coming from the same source locations. And this could be done with innovative tracer studies. Increased residential water quality monitoring needed to provide further insight regarding sampling location implications to water quality in these regions is really something that should be explored further. And then sulfate may be a cost-effective method to evaluate infrastructure failures in regions that have high concentrations in surface water. For instance, not all the residential sites had high sulfate in their lines. It was mainly in areas that had high sulfate also in their watershed monitoring location. So one of the things we would like to investigate in the future is if it is from a source or if it's actually from maybe exposure within the distribution line itself. I'd like to acknowledge UK Cares and thank them for funding this project, along with the extensive help from many of the extension agents in the region, along with the team members and graduate students on the project. And I look forward to being able to talk with you, and Dr. Sanderson will be out there also to answer more questions. Thank you.